Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality, and he's having a tantrum.
There are moments in global politics when a single empty chair says more than 1,000 microphones. Picture this, a crowded international summit hall, cameras clicking, translators whispering, world leaders settling into their places. And yet one seat front row center stage remains untouched. Not because of illness, not because of a crisis back home, but because one man refused to walk into a room where he would not be the center of gravity. That man, of course, is former President Donald Trump. And the question the world whispered, some with amusement, others with concern, was simple. Why isn't he coming? The answer, according to one fiery voice at that summit, was as sharp as it was controversial. Because he has the mentality of a 4-year-old, and he's having a tantrum. Not a diplomatic statement, not a veiled criticism, a direct, blunt accusation that he simply couldn't bear being one of 20 leaders instead of the king of the stage. But behind that stinging remark lies a deeper story, one much larger than Trump himself. A story about a world order shifting under our feet. A story about nations rising, others resisting, and a global balance of power that no longer fits neatly into the old American-led mold many of us grew up believing in. For older Americans, especially those who lived through the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the unchallenged American moment of the 1990s, today's confusion might feel unsettling, even familiar. So here's the real question. Are we witnessing the end of an era, or just another chapter in America's long, turbulent role on the world stage? If you want to understand what comes next and what this moment truly means for the United States, for the world, and for ordinary people who simply want peace and stability, stay with this video. Please share this story if you believe the world deserves clarity, not chaos. And subscribe if you feel that honest conversations matter more than headlines. To understand why that empty chair caused such a stir, we need to look beyond the room itself, beyond Trump's absence, and into the deeper anxieties shaping today's geopolitical landscape. Because as the speaker at the summit made painfully clear, Trump's refusal to attend wasn't an isolated moment. It was a symptom of a nation struggling to accept that it no longer stands alone at the top of the world. According to the speaker, America isn't just irritated, it is in a deeply neurotic funk. And the root of that neurosis, he argued, is not Russia, nor the Middle East, nor global terrorism. It is something far older, steadier, and more patient: China. But here's where the argument becomes even more unsettling. He didn't describe China as a rising military aggressor or an expansionist empire. Instead, he painted the picture of a 4,000-year-old civilization, one that has for most of its history lived in relative stability, governed by sophisticated statecraft, and rarely launching invasions across its borders. He contrasted this with Europe, where kingdoms fought each other almost every decade for 1,000 years, leaving behind scars that still shape politics today. And for an American audience, especially older Americans who lived through decades of Cold War rhetoric, this kind of comparison may feel almost jarring. The speaker pushed the point further. China, he claimed, did not attack Japan for 1,000 years. China did not invade Korea. China invaded Vietnam only once more than 6 centuries ago, and then fought a brief 1-month skirmish in 1979. Meanwhile, he argued the United States cannot even take a year off from military intervention. To him, the difference wasn't simply geopolitical, it was civilizational. That's when the speech took another sharp turn. He suggested that the sudden explosion at a major Venezuelan refinery looked a lot like the CIA. He didn't assert it as confirmed fact, but he framed it as a pattern. Trump publicly said he had authorized CIA operations in Venezuela, and then a week later the country's most important refinery mysteriously blew apart. For the speaker, this was not coincidence, but characteristic behavior of an America unable to function without coercion. For viewers in the audience, especially those who grew up hearing that America was a force for good, this was a provocative challenge, perhaps even an affront. But the speaker wasn't trying to comfort anyone. He was building a case that Washington's frustration comes from a world that no longer bends easily to American demands. To make that point clearer, he introduced a simple but striking economic fact. China's economy has grown 40-fold since 1980, 40 times larger, 40 times more powerful. And it achieved this by doing what Adam Smith described centuries ago: peaceful trade knowledge, transfer stable policy, and steady integration into global markets. While Washington held on to the belief that America was the sole superpower, China was doubling its economy every 7 years, quietly outpacing the United States in manufacturing, in technology, and in the industries of the future. According to the speaker, in just 10 more years, most Americans would be driving Chinese-made electric vehicles, whether they realized it or not. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a psychological one. A shock to the worldview. Many Americans were raised with the belief that America would always lead, always dominate, always be number one. And that brings us back to the empty chair. Trump didn't stay home because of a scheduling conflict. He stayed home, according to the speaker, because he could not endure the symbolism. In his worldview, the United States is supposed to stand above others. At this summit, he would have been merely another face in the crowd and equal in a world moving toward balance instead of hierarchy. And for a nation raised on the idea of exceptionalism, that is not an easy moment to confront. As the speech progressed, the tone shifted from sharp criticism to something far larger, an unfolding historical drama. The speaker began tracing what he described as 3 great cycles of global power, each one shaping the world we live in, and each one now reaching its end. It was at this point that the room grew noticeably quieter. People sensed he wasn't merely attacking one politician or one country. He was telling a story about the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The first cycle, he explained, began around the year 1500, when European sailors armed with new navigation tools, steel and gunpowder ventured across oceans and began reshaping global trade. Before those voyages, he reminded the audience Europe was nothing special. It held no economic or geopolitical supremacy. Asia and the Middle East were far more advanced. But once Europe found its sea routes and discovered the wealth of the Americas, a long ascent began. The second cycle arrived in 1776, not only with the American Declaration of Independence, but with a quiet revolution occurring in a small workshop in Glasgow. James Watt perfected the steam engine. That single invention unlocked the industrial age, handing Britain unprecedented power. For more than a century, the British Empire dominated global trade, production, and warfare, at one point ruling over 1/4 of the world's population. This, the speaker said, gave Europe the military muscle to impose its will on much of the earth. And then came the third cycle, the one many Americans alive today remember firsthand. After Europe destroyed itself, as he put it, through 2 catastrophic world wars, the continent emerged exhausted, bankrupt, and morally discredited. Into that vacuum stepped the United States. America became the new global empire, using not just military force, but financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, global payment systems to retain control. Here, the speaker paused. His voice grew heavier, more deliberate. He argued that the United States learned every imperial tactic from Britain and then expanded it, that Washington could not accept rivals, that instead of building peace with the Soviet Union after World War II, America chose confrontation, leading to decades of Cold War tension. And he insisted that today's conflicts, from Ukraine to Gaza, cannot be separated from that same imperial logic. This was the cow-trow of the entire speech, the moment he declared that all 3 cycles, European exploration, British industrial dominance, and American global supremacy, are ending right now before our eyes. And then he introduced the final piece of his argument, BRICS. He described them not as an alliance, but as the world's new gravitational center. 10 nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE, Iran, and Indonesia, representing 46% of the planet's population and 41% of global GDP. A bloc capable of looking the G7 in the eye and asking, "Who are you to lecture us?" This line drew murmurs across the hall. The speaker argued that BRICS is more than an economic club. It is a declaration that countries no longer need to bow to Washington. He quoted President Lula of Brazil, "We don't need an emperor." And he tied this directly back to Trump's absence. Trump, he said, simply could not endure this new reality, a world where he was not the center. America was not the unquestioned leader, and the rest of the world had begun speaking with its own voice. Then came the reactions. American officials in the room shifted in their seats. European diplomats exchanged glances. African and Asian delegates nodded quietly. The atmosphere was thick, not with anger, but with recognition. A realization that something irreversible was happening. The world wasn't collapsing, it was reorganizing. The speaker insisted the West had misunderstood this transition, mistaking the rise of others for an attack on themselves, and he warned that tantrums, tariffs, and threats would not reverse the tides of history. A new chapter had begun, whether Washington accepted it or not. This was the climax of his message that the American century is ending not with a war, not with a treaty, but with a chair left empty because one man could not bear to sit as an equal in a world finally learning to stand on its own. When the speaker moved from history to the present moment, the emotional weight of the room shifted yet again. He was no longer simply describing cycles of power. He was naming the human cost of those cycles. And for an audience made up of diplomats, academics, and older citizens who have lived through multiple wars, this part of the speech carried a sobering echo. His first example was Ukraine, a conflict that in his telling grew not from ancient hatred, but from a promise broken. He recalled a moment in 1990 when the Soviet Union agreed to allow German reunification. In return, he said the United States promised that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. But after the Soviet collapse, Washington reversed course. NATO moved toward Russia's borders step by step, base by base, until one day the Kremlin pushed back. In this framing, Ukraine did not simply fall victim to an invasion, it became the front line of a geopolitical power struggle that could have been avoided. For the speaker, the tragedy of Ukraine is not only that cities burned and families fled, it is that millions of young Ukrainians, people who trusted Western assurances, paid the price for a strategic miscalculation. To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, he reminded the crowd, quoting Henry Kissinger. To be a friend is fatal. And in those words lay a warning about alliances that promise protection but deliver catastrophe. Then he turned to Gaza, where the consequences are immediate, visible, and devastating. He argued that American military support to Israel, whether justified by politics, history, or strategic interests, has intensified a humanitarian crisis with global moral implications. And in this moment, he praised South Africa for taking Israel to the International Court of Justice over alleged violations of the Genocide Convention of 1948. He called it a courageous act, one driven not by power, but by principle. These weren't abstract political points. They were reminders that when empires make decisions, civilians pay the price. Families lose homes, communities lose generations. And older Americans watching the news, many of whom lived through Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, know exactly what that looks like. From there, the speaker pointed to the quieter tools of empire: financial pressure, sanctions, economic coercion. He painted an almost cinematic image of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., a stretch of road that houses the White House, the Treasury, the Executive Office, the World Bank, and finally the International Monetary Fund. Everything within a few blocks, everything connected, everything, he suggested, answering to the same center of gravity. For countries already struggling with debt, inflation, or unstable governments, being on the wrong side of this financial architecture can mean decades of hardship. Budget cuts, hospital shortages, school closures, unemployment. The consequences might not appear on a battlefield, but they reshape lives just as profoundly. He argued that as American influence fades, these tools of control are losing their power. BRICS nations are creating alternative banks, new payment systems, and new trade routes. The world, especially the global south, is beginning to step out from under the financial shadow of Washington. And the political result, a slow but unstoppable shift: countries reevaluating alliances, questioning old assumptions, seeking partners who respect sovereignty rather than dictate terms. A new era, the speaker implied, where nations large and small want a voice, not instructions. In the end, the civil and political consequences of this historical transition are not just about governments or presidents. They are about ordinary people, parents worrying about rising prices, workers fearing job losses, soldiers on front lines who never asked for war, and older citizens who recognize the familiar pattern: empires rising, empires resisting, and people suffering in the middle. This time, however, the world seems determined not to repeat the same mistakes. From this point in the speech, the spotlight shifted toward the United States itself, not as a global commander, but as a nation wrestling with its own identity. For many older Americans, this part of the message strikes close to home because it speaks to a truth people can feel, even if they cannot yet articulate it. The United States is still powerful, still influential, but no longer alone at the top. And Washington is struggling to understand what that means. The speaker described America today as dangerous because it is confused, not because the nation suddenly became weaker, but because it has never before had to navigate a world where it is not the uncontested center. For generations, Americans saw their country as the anchor of stability, the guarantor of order, the inevitable leader. Now the world is moving toward multipolarity, 3, 4, even 5 centers of influence, and the American political class has not adjusted. He argued that Washington's instinct, whenever challenged, is to reach for familiar tools, tariffs, sanctions, military posturing, geopolitical pressure. But these tools no longer command the submission they once did. China responds to tariffs with counter-tariffs. BRICS responds to sanctions with new financial systems. Nations in the Global South respond to political threats by turning to alternative partners. To the speaker, this is not a sign that the world is collapsing. It is a sign that America's dominance is no longer automatic. He described the rest of the world as moving on not out of hostility, but simply out of necessity. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are forging their own paths, forming trade blocs, energy alliances, and technology partnerships that no longer require Washington's approval. And they are doing so without the anger or rebellion the West imagines. In his words, the world is not fragmenting. The United States is isolating itself. For many listening, especially Americans who lived through the height of U.S. influence, this notion is both unsettling and oddly peaceful. It suggests that the world does not wish to overthrow America, but simply to coexist with it as equals. At the same time, the speaker warned that America's greatest danger now lies not abroad, but at home. A political culture built on the expectation of superiority has difficulty adapting to equality. That frustration, he argued, expresses itself in aggressive foreign policy, nationalist rhetoric, and impulsive leadership traits he associated directly with Donald Trump's decision to skip the summit rather than sit among peers. On the world stage, reactions to America's confusion are mixed. Some nations watch with concern, fearing instability. Others watch with relief, hopeful that a less dominant United States may create space for fairer global governance. Still others watch with confidence, believing their time has finally come. What unites all these reactions is a shared awareness. The American century is giving way to a new era, one where influence is shared, one where no single nation issues the rules, one where legitimacy comes from cooperation, not coercion. The speaker emphasized that this shift does not diminish the United States, it merely changes its role. America can remain influential, prosperous, and respected, but only if it accepts that leadership in the 21st century requires partnership, not dominance. It was a message not meant to humiliate Americans, but to invite reflection, especially among older generations who remember a different world, a different posture, a different America. As the final words of the speech echoed through the hall, something subtle but unmistakable settled over the audience. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Recognition that the world we once knew, the world many older Americans lived through, defended, and believed in, has already shifted beneath our feet. Not suddenly, not violently, but steadily year after year, as new powers rose, old alliances changed, and the global balance of confidence moved away from a single center of gravity. The speaker's warning was not meant to provoke panic. It was meant to awaken perspective. He reminded the room that empires do not fall in a single moment. They fade through denial, through stubbornness, through the refusal to adapt to a world that no longer responds to the old threats, the old demands, or the old assumptions. And in a time when America appears to be withdrawing from conversations it once led, the rest of the world is not collapsing. It is reorganizing itself patiently and boldly. For many who lived through Vietnam, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the Cold War escalation, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the endless cycle of sanctions and interventions that followed the lesson is painfully familiar. When a nation refuses to learn from history, history forces it to learn the hard way. But there was also an invitation in his words, an opening toward something healthier, calmer, and more constructive. He suggested that the United States still has enormous power, enormous creativity, and enormous potential, but only if it chooses partnership over dominance, humility over bravado, dialogue over threats. In today's world, influence is earned, not commanded, and respect flows toward nations that listen rather than intimidate. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, this new way of leadership is rising. People are watching figures like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, witnessing how young leaders speak boldly about sovereignty, fairness, and dignity, ideas that resonate far beyond their borders. These stories, often ignored by mainstream outlets, are becoming some of the most important developments in Africa, news shaping a world where nations once overlooked now hold the microphone. And so the real question now passes to us, ordinary citizens, especially those who have seen the arc of history long enough to recognize the patterns. What role should America play in this new century? Should we cling to the past or help build a world where power is shared and respected? Your voice matters in that conversation. Your perspective matters. And your experience, decades of watching the world evolve, gives you something the next generation desperately needs: clarity. If this message spoke to you, if you believe honesty matters more than slogans, if you feel that understanding the rise of new leaders from Washington to Ouagadougou is essential for the future, please share this story so others can see it too. And subscribe if you believe that truth, real, unfiltered truth, is more important than the headlines.